It's been 1 year in office for the 46th President of the United States. Joe Biden promised to build back better, but with America as divided as ever, how much has he really achieved? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Joe Biden. With over 80 million votes, more Americans chose to elect Joe Biden than any other president in U.S. history. But 1 year into his term, how much has the country's oldest ever chief executive been able to deliver? President Biden came to office at a time when the U.S. had arguably never felt more divided. And it was facing some of its most daunting challenges. In his first year alone, Biden's had to deal with a global pandemic, peak inflation alongside staggering government debt, while promising to end America's longest war. And let's not forget the country's rupturing racial fault lines. Let's take a look now at some of his wins and losses. Now, the coronavirus pandemic was by far Biden's biggest and toughest challenge upon taking office. Vaccine and masking hesitancy, made worse by the Delta and Omicron waves, have devastated his plans to rescue America from what he called a once-in-a-century virus stalking the country. Today, despite a robust vaccine rollout, the U.S. death toll stands at over 800,000. It's been a bittersweet year for the U.S. economy. Jobless claims hit a 50-year low. The stock market has smashed records, and the economy grew by roughly 7% in the last quarter of 2021. But inflation has set alarm bells ringing. The Federal Reserve has had to take a tough stance, and supply chain issues are plaguing economic recovery. Biden signed a $1 trillion infrastructure bill into law in November, but the dividends of his Build Back Better plan have yet to pay off. On the foreign policy front, Biden has faced severe criticism over the shocking U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, leading to the Taliban's return to power. Further east, his top diplomats are hard at work shoring up a regional bloc to counter China's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific region. But his biggest challenge could lie in countering perceived Russian aggression over Ukraine. Well, on the eve of his anniversary in office Wednesday night, President Biden addressed the nation, defending his track record so far while acknowledging frustrations.
Look, I didn't overpromise, but I think if you take a look at what we've been able to do, you'd have to acknowledge we made enormous progress. But one of the things that I think is something that, one thing I haven't been able to do so far is get my Republican friends to get in the game of making things better in this country. I did not anticipate that there'd be such a stalwart effort to make sure that the most important thing was that President Biden didn't get anything done. Think about this. What are Republicans for? What are they for? Name me one thing they're for.
So how is Joe Biden being judged a year into his term, and can he blame entrenched political division for a failure to deliver on his agenda? Well, joining me now to discuss that and more, from Columbus, Ohio, is Mitch Lerner. He's a professor of American history and the associate director of the East Asia Studies Center at Ohio State University. Steve Okun joins us from Singapore. He was a lawyer in the administration of Democratic President Bill Clinton and is now the CEO of APAC Advisors. And completing our panel is Associate Professor Robert Gutsche Jr. from Lancaster University. He is the author of the upcoming book, The Future of the Presidency, Democracy and Journalism After Trump. Thanks all so much for being with us. Mitch, I'll start with you. If you could grade Biden now after this first year in office, what would you give his performance so far? And are low approval ratings, do you think right now, justified?
Well, first, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here. If I had to grade the president, I think the first thing we should note is that he gets an incomplete because it's only 1 year into the term. There are lots of presidents who have struggled out of the blocks. You know, your approval rating is always sky high after you've won your election, and they tend to steadily fall over the first year. So Obama was down in the 40s, Reagan was down in the 40s. They were both reelected and are generally considered successful presidents. But to go beyond that a little bit, I think his record is probably a solid C, maybe a little bit higher. He certainly has some accomplishments, and I think that a lot of them are being a little too quickly dismissed. And I think when we look back at his record in history, we'll see a pretty significant infrastructure bill that is passed with bipartisan support in a way that we haven't seen a lot of. We'll see a pretty significant COVID relief bill. We see the United States getting back into the conversation about climate change, negotiations with Iran. Unemployment is low, GDP is strong. So there are a lot of positives, but there are issues as well. The COVID response hasn't been great. Obviously, there are concerns with inflation. So if things were to end today, and obviously they're not, but if they were to end today, I think his record would be seen as fairly solid, but certainly not living up to expectations of many of his supporters.
Okay. Robert Gutsche, you're also a professor. Does a C sound fair, satisfactory at best?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the really unfair questions, because as our guest pointed out, it's kind of hard to judge, so definitively so early on. But I think an unfair question might be how Republicans feel about Joe Biden, and more importantly, people who voted for Donald Trump, who may or may not be with that Republican base, but are certainly Trump supporters. And why am I bringing that up? Well, I think that is an important aspect. We have at least two dominant societies in the United States because of the two-party system, but certainly because of Donald Trump and the divisiveness that came along with it. That divisiveness was there long before Donald Trump, and it certainly remains. And I think if we were to learn anything from the last administration and relationships between publics and journalism, for instance, we might want to be asking questions of those Trump supporters who may not just be diehard Trump can do no wrong and everybody else is horrible, but really looking at that part of society to judge where we are. And I think that's important for Joe Biden to be asking that question too.
Okay, fair enough. Let me ask Steve, some say it's just typical in judging presidents for expectations to just be too high. Is that fair with Joe Biden, or is he just doing a very average job so far?
I think the bigger issue for Joe Biden going into the second year is what is he going to do now? Because he does have a couple significant wins on the board. But what is it that the American people are really focused on now? They're focused on COVID, and they're focused on inflation and the broader economy. And what has Joe Biden spent the last month or so really talking about? It's been about voting rights, and it's been about Build Back Better, which nobody knows what goes into the Build Back Better. Right? So if Joe Biden shifts that focus, he's going to have, obviously, voting rights is very important. We could talk about the difference, right, between voter suppression and voter subversion. And it looks like that the whole Congress now is going to focus on voter subversion, which is a real critical issue. But if Congress can take care of that, if Biden in the second year can get COVID back to where it should be in terms of testing and in terms of keeping the schools open, and if he can focus on the economy as much as a president can, it's unfair in a way, and if he can focus on that, he can have a really good second year. And you saw him pivot to those things in the press conference today when he started talking about, let's break up Build Back Better and let's pass what we can.
Okay, Steve, very quickly, though, on the Build Back Better, because it is such a pillar of his administration, when will the American public actually see some dividends there? When are they actually going to tangibly see what has come out of that legislation?
Well, you have to get it passed. It's very clear right now that the package at $1.8 trillion is not going to go forward because of Senator Manchin and maybe one or two other senators. So you're going to take chunks of that out that people do care about. And look, people care about the climate, and you can get $500 million passed, maybe bipartisan, certainly through a 50-vote reconciliation package in the Senate that will get passed by the House. So you've now got a realization by the Democrats on both sides, Manchin and Biden, and then Warren and Sanders, that we have to pass something. So I am optimistic that something significant will pass in Q1 of this year. It's not going to be 1.8 trillion,
I was more talking about, I was more talking about the actual payoff from the investments themselves, the physical infrastructure that he's promising, when it will make a real difference to Americans' lives so that they can say, hey, okay, now we see why he fought so hard for this policy. I mean, do you just have a time scale? When will we see something?
Well, the infrastructure bill has passed, and they're going to start, looking for those construction-ready products. They're going to start looking for where they can increase broadband. So all of that is going to happen. That passed, and you've got Republicans who voted against it taking credit for it. So Americans are going to start to see that going into the midterms. Build Back Better will take a lot longer to pass, but the administration will focus on the 1.2 trillion that did pass. That is probably the president's one of his two biggest accomplishments in year one. So you're going to start seeing that soon.
Okay. Mitch, if we can turn to foreign policy now, you have said actually that Biden deserves credit for ending the war in Afghanistan, but others, say that sudden withdrawal was an unmitigated disaster that not only disappointed and kind of humiliated Americans in the eyes of the world, but, really marked an end to hope for so many Afghan people that had been fought for 20 years with U.S. troops. But why do you think it was still somewhat a victory for him?
Yeah, so there's a small answer here and a bigger answer. I think that it is a relative success. One of the things that Biden ran on was ending the war in Afghanistan, and he did so. Now, obviously, he did it in a way that wasn't perfect, but I can tell you as a historian of 20th century American foreign policy that wars don't always end neatly, right? And if your viewers are old enough to remember the Vietnam War, they remember helicopters flying off the embassy roof in Saigon and Marines fighting off people trying to break into the compound. If they remember all the way back to the Korean War, similar story there with South Korean President Syngman Rhee releasing prisoners of war at the last minute because he didn't like the terms. Wars just don't end neatly. And I think that in the long run, it will be remembered as a success that he delivered on a promise, even while the end obviously didn't go as well as he would have liked. The bigger issue here, and it touches on a lot of the things that you've said already, I think that Biden's biggest failure, perhaps, is that he's not been able to grab control of the media narrative in a lot of these things. There's an important new book by a professor at the University of Texas called The Impossible Presidency. And the argument is that it's almost impossible to be a successful president these days because in addition to the practical aspects of it, there's a sort of symbolic and a public relations aspect that's become so complicated in the era of social media that it's hard to do both. I think that Donald Trump was the master of that sort of capturing the narrative and sucking all the air out of the room to make everything about him, even while he was bad at the practical stuff. It's the opposite, I think, with Biden. I think he's had some successes on a practical level. Infrastructure that Steve was just talking about. It's a good example here. We haven't seen the tangible benefits yet, and the Republicans were able to sort of spin that as, another example of government waste. Obviously, as Steve said, a couple of them supported it, but many of them didn't. The reality is we should start seeing those effects soon enough, but the popular consensus is already kind of shaped against it because Biden, I think, simply doesn't have, or his team hasn't shown to this point, an ability to really master the media narrative and get his successes out there the way that they should have.
Right. Robert, I could see you agreeing there. And I mean, is part of this, Joe Biden has aged. He's been in politics for decades now, and he is an older man. And people do tend to point that out a lot in the media. Is that part of why he hasn't been able to get control of that, media narrative that Mitch was referring to?
Well, and not to slant towards ageism here. I mean, you have Bernie Sanders, who, when running for president, also is up there in age, but was out there swinging a baseball bat, right? Which was symbolic not just of his energy to do policy, but his energy to actually participate physically and emotionally and mentally in the processes here. I think that the optics for Joe Biden are absolutely horrible. And I think part of the issue is you also have Harris, who's a young vice president who has a lot of things on her own resume, whether people liked her as a candidate or as a vice president or not. But she certainly is the first of many different identities in the White House and in that office of vice president. And I think what we're seeing is also this tension between the two offices. I mean, there may or may not be a breakdown or change in relationship between the two individuals, but those offices between the vice president and the president have always been contentious over the period of an administration, simply about who gets a spotlight, who gets a seat at the table, so on and so forth. And I think that there's, a young Harris who wants to go out and do things and be seen, but also support Joe Biden, but also Joe Biden, who just simply can't seem to string words together very well. I don't know that I do much better, but certainly he's a little bit slower at it. And I think that optics really becomes crucial as we're going into midterms, but also as we're talking about the next presidency, when he's asked, and the simple answer that sticks in people's mind is, well, I don't know, if I am, I might, if things go well, or if he's doing well. And I kind of think that leaves a lot of uncertainty, not just for what's going in the next presidency, but over the next 2 or 3 years.
Right. Let me pick up on that because, Steve, many U.S. presidents, when they enter office, need to start relatively soon after about thinking about how to get reelected in 4 years' time. But is that the case with Joe Biden? Because he made a point of saying that he really only intended on taking on one term. And many thought that whoever he chose as his vice president was going to be the next candidate. We're not seeing that kind of relationship develop where he's putting Kamala Harris out front to make the U.S. public comfortable with her kind of taking the reins when he is supposed to kind of step aside in 3 more years. What's going on there? And I mean, could this work against the Democratic Party?
Well, let's look at where we were a year ago, right? We had just had an armed insurrection on the Capitol with deaths. We did not know going into Inauguration Day whether there was going to be more violence in Washington, D.C. We had COVID was rampaging through the country. And that's the situation Joe Biden had to deal with this year. We don't have that anymore. So it's a whole different ballgame now in terms of where he is. And we need to judge him on what he inherited and where to go forward. In terms of being the oldest president ever elected, look, he is really the first president maybe in history where there's a question on day one whether he's going to run for a second term. And so because of his age. And so that's something that has to be navigated. When it comes to the Biden-Harris relationship, I think, Kamala Harris is one of the first vice presidents ever to become vice president with less Washington experience than her boss. And because of that, she doesn't bring to the vice presidency what Biden brought to the vice presidency for Obama, what Cheney brought for Bush, what Gore brought for Clinton, and on and on and on. So they have to feel those things through. You're seeing a retooling and a resetting a bit of what the vice president is going to do. And the question will have to answer itself after the midterms if President Biden is going to seek a second term. So what he's got to focus on now is resetting for year 2, resetting for an era of inflation, and getting it done.
Steve, quickly, I just want to give 1 minute to, I want to go back to foreign affairs, actually, foreign policy on behalf of the Biden administration. I addressed Afghanistan with Mitch. We had heard mention of the Paris Climate Accord. That promise was immediately delivered on. He has done a little bit less regarding joining the JCPOA again, the Iran nuclear accord. But how much does that really matter to the U.S. public in judging his success so far?
Look, I'm going to be very flip. It really doesn't matter in terms of foreign policy. We're sitting here in Singapore. He's got a trilemma he has to deal with. What is going to happen with U.S.-China relations? That's still basically no further along than it was a year ago. What's going to happen with the Indo-Pacific economic strategy? He's got very good alliances going with Japan and Australia and India, but nothing concrete to show for it. And he has to figure out what to do, especially with Southeast Asia, which is caught between the U.S. and China. This is a year he's going to need of action in terms of foreign policy. It's extremely important to the U.S. from a geostrategic perspective, somewhat from an economic perspective, but look, not really from a political perspective in terms of influencing the midterms or whether or not he's going to get reelected.
Okay. I'll tell you what, I want to move forward because we are less than a year away from midterm elections, and it's looking a bit bleak, actually, for Democrats at the moment. We have a stalled legislative agenda. There's some losses over the pandemic, and the lack of a clear political strategy have kind of set alarm bells ringing within the Democratic Party. So deep racial and economic divides are also continuing to plague the country. And then to top it off, we've got Biden's attempts to pass a bill protecting voting rights that actually failed in the Senate. Mitch, let me come back to you. If we look forward now to the midterms, first it has to be said that I guess it's a pretty regular pattern that whenever one party controls the legislative and executive, they tend to kind of lose control in the next election. Still, though, what have the Democrats at least been able to achieve with their hold on the legislative and executive branches now? I mean, were valuable opportunities lost in a way to use their majority better to their advantage, not least because they have two senators that sided with the Republicans on several issues?
So it's a great question. I'd start by saying I don't know how much we can fault them for wasting the advantage that they had in the positions that they hold, simply because, and this hovers over all of the debate today, I think, there is such an intractable opposition. Biden faces political opposition, the likes of which I don't know that we've seen in this country since the Civil War. And the Republican Party is clearly devoted to bringing him down, even if that means risking the democratic process to do so. I mean, we live in a society where right now somewhere between 60 and 70% of Republicans believe the election was stolen and he's not even legitimate. So how much could have been done within that context, I think, is an important question to ask. As for the midterms, I think there are some signs of optimism, perhaps, for the Democrats. Certainly, they are the underdog and they should be. But I don't think it's as bad as it might be. First of all, it's a long time away. But more than that, these traditions that you point to about, the incumbent party holding the executive and the legislative and being hit pretty hard in the midterms, it's true throughout World War II. Really, since World War II, under those circumstances, a president who's got a public approval rating below 50% loses about 40 seats in the House. But these are different times. We're in a more polarized political environment than we've really been in that era at all. And so I think what we used to say is a popular president can help to mitigate that by turning out his own voters. We no longer run elections that way. It's less about turning out your own, less about mobilizing that middle ground voter by being really popular, and it's more about mobilizing against the opposition. So I think there are still some cards to play for the Democrats in justifiably pointing out some of the threats that the Republican Party presents. And I think that might mitigate some of the losses. And there are some other examples in the Senate where the Republicans have lost their best candidates and Democrats are running strong races. So there's some reasons for optimism.
Robert Gutsche, let me ask you, how do Americans feel really, though, now about having the judiciary controlled by conservatives? That's not up for election. There is a very strong conservative line in the Supreme Court right now. Do you think that could affect their choices in the midterm elections, with the conservative judiciary really affecting and deciding on some very fundamental issues in the country?
Well, I think, the Supreme Court, certainly during the Donald Trump administration, was something that got a lot of attention in the public, simply because the number of seats that were open that he placed. And I think that that's a really interesting point for bringing in the discussion to the average American about what Biden can do, right? That's not an area where he can necessarily place some new folk unless something happens in the next couple of years here. But I think that he needs to come out and say where he stands in terms of the role of the court, the role of these different branches, and really bring down to a level playing field here, a conversation about the different, about how politics works. I mean, if he's going to be known as just the president who came in after Donald Trump, if that's where he wants to go, because quite frankly, it'd be nice to know kind of what Joe Biden stands for and where he sees himself. This could be kind of that blank slate sort of moment for him to not just re-educate or indoctrinate Americans to the political system, but use issues like voting rights, use issues like the debate that comes up about the Electoral College constantly every 4 years, to really help bring us together around the system that we have that was under attack physically a year ago. I mean, I think Americans are sitting back and saying, we're still talking about this thing from a year ago, but Congress hasn't been able to get through an actual investigation into what did or didn't happen on January 6th. And so I think a lot of Americans are searching for what is the political system that we're in. And I think that this, if Joe Biden's going to be a one-term president, what is he going to leave in his legacy at this point? Could it be helping us come together around what our system is?
Steve, go ahead.
Look, here's how the scenario under which the Democrats win. And to get to your Supreme Court decision, if the Supreme Court outlaws, outright overturns Roe v. Wade, and the right to choose is eliminated as a federal right and goes away in dozens and dozens of states, that is going to mobilize Democratic voters. And there's a real possibility that this Republican appointed majority Supreme Court could do that. If that happens, and at the same time, the economy improves because inflation does come down, but you keep unemployment low, COVID gets to a much lower level, and the Democrats can pass popular things in the Congress, like climate change, like providing universal pre-K. If the Democrats can do all of those things, and boy, that's pulling an inside straight, but if they can do that, yeah, the Democrats have a chance to hold the House. But that's a real tall order. They've got to be lucky on the economy. They got to be lucky on COVID. They've got to be smart
Right.
politically, and they got to get the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Okay.
All possible, but.
Steve, you will get the last word. So unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us, and our viewers as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.